Hi everyone, this is Leatherass with PokerStrategy.com. Today we have part 3 on the 3-bet pot series. So far it's been a really sort of intense, kind of grueling series. We're going on 3 hours, approximately 3 hours on one subject by the end of this video if you've watched parts 1 and 2. And if you haven't watched parts 1 and 2, I would definitely recommend doing so. It's a lot of content. It's a lot of time to spend on one given subject, but I know it's a subject that is certainly troubling for a lot of people. It's been troubling to me over my career, certainly as I was progressing up the stakes and trying to figure out, hey, how do you play these 3-bet pots? They're tough. People kind of just barrel on you, and you're not really, you flop a lot of marginal situations, and it's just sort of a really, it's not a straightforward spot in poker. It's much more difficult, I should say, to solve for mathematically. It's there's just a lot of little nuances to playing 3-bet pots, and hopefully we're kind of going over a lot of those. I said earlier that at the end of part 2 that this would be somewhat of a challenging video to kind of slug through, but if you do, hopefully it'd be pretty rewarding. And then I also promised that in part 3 we'd have a lot more examples and kind of keep it a little more fun and interactive, and not so much just kind of grinding on small little things. So with that in mind, we'll go ahead and kick off the video here and pick up where we left off in the last part. And we'll pick up here with post-flop play. And we've talked a lot about stack sizes and how it's important to pay attention to stack sizes throughout the video. It's especially important, I should say, pre-flop to determine if you're possibly going to run a multi-street bluff. Are stack sizes deep enough? If you haven't determined that by the time or before you 3-bet your opponent, you certainly want to make sure you're paying attention to it now with post-flop play. And it's really important to pay attention to stack sizes, and particularly the question of, are stacks deep enough to run a multi-street bluff? There are times when it's a really great situation to run a multi-street bluff, and there are times when it's a really bad situation depending on stack sizes. Generally speaking, the deeper the stacks are, the better the situation it will be to run better the situation will be for you to run a multi-street bluff. There are a lot of advantages to having deep stacks, and I really like to actually start 3-betting people a lot more when we get 150 plus blinds deep. At least 150, 200, 250, 300. Like you get in these deep stack live games, you might get 600, 700, 800, 1,000 plus blinds. In Vegas this summer, I played a lot of poker at the World Series, and I very rarely had under 1,000 blinds in front of me. I would usually reload to make sure I had at least 1,000 blinds, and that's kind of the way I like to play poker. I think that that's where the most edge is. But in online, we're mostly dealing with 100 big blind stacks, and then sometimes people get deep and they get 200 big blinds if they stack somebody. If you happen to stack somebody and somebody else happens to stack somebody, you can both get pretty deep. And this is a really great spot to really put the heat on people, because it's a little more difficult for them to 4-bet you, especially out of position when stacks get deep, because you can oftentimes even call a 4-bet with a hand that you 3-bet with. If you 3-bet like a 9-10 suited, for example, and my opponent and I are 250 big blinds deep, and they make one of these smallish 4-bets that so many people love to do, I'm definitely not folding to a 4-bet if I can play a pot in position deep stacked with a hand like 9-10 suited. So it takes away a little bit of that weapon, but more importantly, in my opinion, what it does is it allows you to run multi-street bluffs, and on good boards to do so, and win more money from your opponent than you might if they were shallower stacked. So a good example of that is when you and your opponent are, say, 200 blinds deep, or let's start with you and your opponent being 100 blinds deep, And let's say you 3-bet a hand like we've talked about earlier, like King Jack offsuit, and the flop comes down all numbers after they cold call you out of position, and you decide that they're going to be on a middle pair error so much, or I should say when they check call you that they're going to be on a middle pair that will eventually fold to a triple barrel. Well, if you're 100 big blinds deep and you make it, they make it 3 blinds to start and you make it 9 blinds, now there's 18 blinds in the middle. And in order to really run a big multi-street bluff, you sort of have to bet like half pot. You'll be betting like 10 blinds on the flop, and then if you get called, there'll be approximately 40 blinds in the pot and about 80 behind. And so you might bet like 21 or 2 on the turn, and you're leaving yourself with 55 to 65 blinds by the river, which is generally around a pot size bet approximately. And if they check to you, you fire all in and you hope to win the pot. But if stacks are 200 big blinds deep, then you really don't need to worry about sizing your bets to maintain a credible, threatening river bet. So I don't need to just make these little half pot bets on the flop and half pot bets on the turn to set up a larger, more pot size bet on the river to maximize my fold equity, but rather I can start making 3/4 to full pot size bets on the flop and turn, and then on the river I can shove, and if they fold, rather than winning half pot bets on the flop and turn from my opponent before they fold, I can win closer to full size bets on the flop and turn before they fold the river. So there's a really huge advantage to that. Now obviously increasing your variance, because you might be getting 200 blinds in the middle as a bluff, but assuming all the plays we're making are profitable, and assuming you're following my bankroll management strategies that I've most of but I'll repeat again, I recommend if you're a professional player and you rely solely on poker for your income, that you never play limits for which you don't have 100 blinds for, or 100 buy-ins for, or 10,000 big blinds in this case. So if you're playing 1-2, I would say you should have 1-2 no limit, 100 buy-in game, 100 big blind buy-in game. Then I would recommend you have approximately $20,000 in your account before you do so. Now only if you're a professional player relying on poker as your sole source of income. If you're a recreational player, then it matters less what the bankroll management requirements you follow. But so if you're following those requirements, you certainly don't have to worry a whole lot about the variance aspect. You just want to be worried about making profitable bets over and over and over again, and your bankroll really shouldn't be relevant to whether or not you make a certain play if you're playing within your comfort zone. So that's really important. To use an example to sort of illustrate this concept that I was talking about earlier, let's pull a hand out of my Hold'em Manager database where I was playing against a good player. I believe has been a multi-million-dollar winner over the years, a player with the screen name Punkity, and he and I face off in a pot here. He opens to 28 in early position, and I took a hand like Queen 10 offsuit and 3-bet, which I'm not always 3-betting this hand, but I believe that this particular opponent probably calls a little too wide out of position. Will probably give me a lot of credit post flop. So I flop a gut shot here, but more importantly, I think because I raise an under the gun raiser, I can represent really well a hand like aces, kings, ace king, ace queen, hands that would certainly go for 3 streets of value if getting check called. And I think that my opponent is pretty likely to peel with hands out of position like king jack suited, ace x suited, hands that are really going to hate getting triple barreled on. But as we can see here, I made my pre-flop raise about 3 times, my pre-flop re-raise, I should say, about 3 times the Punkity's opening size. And so if you notice here, he checks, and I have to bet, slightly. I guess I actually probably bet a little too much. I should probably actually bet slightly under half pot to size my bets a little better, because stacks are already getting a little awkward here, and my opponent checks, and I think I start to realize that I need to kind of cool my jets a little and make smallish bets. So I bet a little under half pot here. But even so, I was sort of left in a situation where the pot was 825 and I had 595, so I had about almost 60 big blinds remaining, which is just barely credible enough to induce a fold here. I wouldn't want to make this bet if the pot were like 1100, or if I only had 400 into this pot left. I wouldn't always barrel here, just because I think that so much of the time they're just going to toss in their chips because there's so little remaining. Now it can work both ways, in the sense that people might give you more credit on your bluffs the smaller the bet is, because you know, it looks like, hey, why would somebody run this bluff against me here in this spot and bluff me so little? It almost has to be for value. So it can work both ways, but oftentimes when there are missed draws, in this case there's a flush draw that missed, they might be more inclined to just toss in the chips, figuring that some draws might just bet anyway because it's the only way they can win, and then some goofy hands like mine can kind of show up from time to time, so maybe their call might be profitable, or they just don't think that deeply at all. They just see a smallish bet and they just call it with a hand that beats a bluff. So here in this spot, I did go ahead and triple barrel, and was fortunate enough for the play to work. I just thought that my opponent was on, you know, some type of you know, king queen suited type of hand, some type of hand that was essentially just keeping me honest. They could occasionally be on like a flush draw, in which case I wouldn't even need to bet the river. They could be on a hand like that for sure, because a hand like 9-10 of clubs might not want to check raise here in this spot on this flop, because it figures that I'm just never going to get away from so much of my 3-betting range, that my 3-betting and flop betting range, because some of the times here people will 3-bet hands like pocket jacks, pocket queens, and then check behind on these types of flops. So when I'm betting, it sort of reduces some of those types of hands in his mind that I can have, and so now they're only beating you know, even a smaller percentage of my flop betting range. Although pretty often I will pretty much ignore my hand if I have jacks here and just figure that it's a tough board for my opponent to reach showdown if I triple barrel, and I'll just turn jacks into a bluff and bet all 3 streets here, just as I would with queen 10. But I don't know if my opponent thinks that I would do that necessarily. They might think I might check behind a hand like that. So you know, this hand is not super interesting, and that's not why I picked it, but I just wanted to show this situation where stacks can get really shallow in 3-bet pots. And so if we had 2,000, so I guess in this situation I won about slightly over $400 in this pot from my opponent. Now if stacks had been deeper, let's say I had 2K and my opponent had 2K, and we'll go back to the flop here. The flop's 195. Now I could have bet something closer to like 170 if I had, you know, 1900 behind, and my opponent had, you know, another 1,000 behind as well. I could bet something like 160, 170 on the flop, and then by the turn the pot would be what, around 520, and then I could bet something like 470 on the turn, and now I can win, you know, $600, $700, $800 without showdown in a pot where, because stacks were shallow, I was only able to win about $400 or so dollars from my opponent. So stacks make a very, very big difference in those situations, and I think it's really important to especially focus your 3-bets when stacks get a little deeper, so you don't have to run into these bet sizing issues. Now, a lot of what goes into that decision now that is knowing my opponent's tendencies, which brings us to B, knowing your opponent's tendencies. Now, I felt that my opponent, like I said earlier when I was describing the hand, I thought would pretty often give me credit eventually, and I thought that they peeled too wide out of position in 3-bet pots, and then pre-flop, and then both post-flop, but made it to showdown with sort of a sensible range. I don't think my opponent was going to call me down with a weak ace when they can only beat a bluff. And I basically just didn't think that they would reach showdown with all their bluff catching type of hands. I mean, I guess King Jack in that situation is about the same as like Ace 8 is there in that by the river in that hand that we showed, in the sense that they still beat all of my bluffs, and I'm very unlikely to be on to be value betting with a hand like King Queen, for example, in which case King Jack wouldn't be the same as Ace 8. So I'm not really going to be doing that. So those two hands are essentially the kind of the same, and so I just felt really strongly that my opponent. I felt really strongly in my read and knowing their tendencies, and I thought that my opponent doesn't necessarily play fit or fold in 3-bet pots, but like I said, goes to showdown with only a more sensible range. But it's definitely very important to know your opponent's tendencies and know how they tend to play certain spots. You know, if you 3-bet them with, you know, let's say a hand like Ace Jack and the flop comes 9-5 deuce, you know, so it's really dry. Unless they flopped a set or slow played like aces and kings pre-flop, they're generally not going to be strong when they're calling a 3-bet out of position, and you 3-bet them with a hand like Ace Jack off. And the flop comes down 9-5 deuce. Now, are they going to have this sort of fit or fold mentality? Like, are they just going to check fold every time they don't flop a set with their, you know, 10s through deuces when they call out of position? Or are they going to, you know, just lay down a hand like Queen Jack suited? If they peeled out of position, the flop comes down 10-8 deuce, which gives them some sort of hand that, you know, is pretty marginal, and might be a hand that a more aggressive player might take a much more aggressive action, but maybe that they would just check fold on a flop like that when they have Queen Jack. You know, so what do you know about your opponents and their tendencies? And I really encourage people to take a lot of notes in those spots. You know, anytime you can observe a 3-bet pot, definitely try and pay attention to it, even if you're not involved. There's really a lot that can be gained there. If you see somebody check raise on a 9-5 deuce flop, and after getting 3-bet and calling out of position, they check raise a 9-5 deuce flop, and the pot goes to showdown, and you see they have a hand like pocket fives. Well, this tells you a couple of things, a couple of really great notes you can take on this spot, and this is really, really important. So please pay attention. There's a couple of really good notes that you can take from that. First of all, this opponent is pretty likely to peel out of position with pocket pairs, and that's a really important thing to recognize, because if they are opening their pocket pairs pre-flop and then calling 3-bets out of position with the pocket pairs, well, we can assume that since pocket pairs don't flop draws very often, they tend to just flop just amazingly well, like they flop pretty much the nuts like pocket fives would on 9-5 deuce flop, or they just flop something terrible. The flop comes, you know, Jack 9-3, and they have pocket fives, and you know, and then they're probably just going to be check folding those types of flops, or maybe check calling one, trying to keep you honest with, like, in case you have ace king or ace queen type of hand, at least this is what their mentality is like, and then check folding so many turns. So that's a great note to be able to take, to know that they will call 3-bets out of position with pocket pairs, because what that means is that you can 3-bet them, and every time they have a pocket pair, you can just c-bet the flop and expect it to work pretty much every time they don't flop a set, which is going to be 7 out of 8 times. So that's just a great opponent. Imagine if you could, playing a 5-10 game, they open for 30 and you make it 90, and your opponent calls 90 plus the blinds in there, so there's $105 that isn't yours, and they just check fold 7 out of 8 flops in that situation. Well, 7 out of 8 times you're going to win, $105, which is a pretty nice situation, to say the least. And then the one time out of 8, you're going to lose, the 90 you put in pre-flop, and then maybe $100 or so continuation bet. And so out of your net, sort of out of those 8 situations that you 3-bet them and they called it pocket pairs, you made something like $500, which is pretty outstanding. I mean, unless you are going to be going broke on the 1 out of 8 times that they flop a set, which I highly doubt is going to be the case, because so often you're going to have hands like, especially after watching this video, like the Queen 10 offsuit that I have, that's very rarely going to flop so strong that you're going to be able to withstand a check raise and want to get the money in pretty happily. So for the most part, you're going to lose the flop continuation bet. Maybe occasionally you just go broke because you flop top pair on a draw heavy board and they check raise you and you put them on a draw, and occasionally you do go broke. So it's maybe not quite as profitable as I maybe initially made it sound, but you kind of get my drift. I mean, if you're 3-betting people and 7 out of 8 times they're check folding the flop, that's pretty strong. That's a pretty good situation. And the second note that you can take in this spot, if they check raised, on the 9-5 deuce rainbow flop, is that presumably if we're 3-betting pretty wide here in this spot, if we're 3-betting somebody pretty wide, I should say, and they should get a sense eventually that we're not always on aces, kings, and ace king here and queens, that we have a lot of different types of hands in our range, because maybe we're 3-betting them very frequently because of the way they play. Well, it would stand to reason in my mind that if I were that person and I called out of position with pocket fives and the flop came 9-5 deuce, about the last thing on earth I would want to do is check raise that opponent on the flop, because it's a great flop for me to represent a hand like pocket sevens by check calling the flop and encourage my opponent to continue to barrel, or just hope that they catch up a little and maybe they have a king jack and they can turn a king and then become very confident about their hand, and then just think that they're value betting rather than trying to blow me off the hand. So about the last thing I would want to do is check raise on a 9-5 deuce flop with a set. Even if there was a flush draw on the board, I would not want to check raise in those spots. I would just want to basically be trapping and trying to encourage my opponent to triple barrel bluff me and get the money in that way. Maybe if stacks are super deep, I might take a line that's like check call, check raise all in. But I would certainly never be putting in action. I would want to represent that sort of weakness. So for that opponent to really, I guess, not understand their opponent's ranges too well, if they're getting 3-bet, fairly wide like people are doing in the 5-10 games, and then when they do flop a set or check raising in those spots, then they're really taking away, they're taking the play away, the play that that person generally frustrates them so much with by just barreling on them so much, and then taking that play away from them, and essentially just hoping they'll go broke with aces or kings on a flop like that. Like if they got check raise on 9-5 deuce, basically that opponent is going to need to have the person who 3-bet them have a really strong hand themselves to go ahead and want to get all the money in. So what's much more common if they're getting 3-bet a lot is that their opponent is going to flop nothing on the 9-5 deuce flop, or just hands that would go broke like kings and aces might just, are very highly likely to just continue to barrel for value anyway. So I would think that that would be a really great note, and that would tell me so much about that opponent. I would know first off that that opponent is a great opponent to 3-bet, because I can expect them to peel out of position with their pocket pairs, and then check fold 7 out of 8 times on the flop. Pretty much any time they don't flop a set. Maybe they times that they flop a or I should say, we don't know that they have a pocket pair, of course, so we don't know that we're just it's gonna work 7 out of 8 times, but we know that when they do have a pocket pair, it should work a really high percentage of the time. So that's a really good thing. And I suppose if they flop like pocket fives and the flop's 3, 4, 6, they're not just check folding that flop. But those flops are sort of few and far between. For the most part, they're just whiffing, and there's a bunch of overcards. And so that opponent is really spectacular. And then I also know that they're not going to trap me into bluffing off my whole stack, because they're just going to fast play their set in those situations. So that gives me a huge discount on my my play, in the sense that against an opponent who would play me a little more trappy, I know that when they have a pocket pair, after I 3-bet them, my flop bet should work 7 out of 8 times. But if they're going to trap me pretty well on the 1 time out of 8 and get me for a lot of money, then because they're going to just be check calling their 9-5 deuce, or their pocket fives on the 9-5 deuce flop, and just letting me barrel off so often, then that really detracts quite a bit from the value of that opponent. So I think they would still be profitable, but not nearly as profitable. So it's really important to take notes in these spots, and really important to kind of understand your opponent's tendencies. If you think that they play 2-fit or fold in 3-bet pots, they're just really hoping to flop really strong hands, and they're not really wanting to go broke with just like a 1-pair type of hand in a 3-bet pot. Well, that's fantastic, because you can just put a lot of pressure on that opponent and expect it to work so often. And hand reading is obviously really important as well. I mean, you want to be able to really not make the mistake of interpreting or I guess trying to give your opponents too much credit for a really a strong thought process. I think a lot of times people make the mistake of maybe too heavily weighting some actions over others, when that isn't just not going to be the case. And so that probably isn't going to make a whole lot of sense just right off the bat. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of go through this hand, and you'll kind of see what I'm talking about here. So this opponent min raises from early-ish position. They're pretty wide openers. You can see they're 24-14. Mine says 14-10. I'm not a 14-10 in full ring. I don't know exactly what I am, but I think it's more like a 18-14 in full ring, or 17-14, somewhere in there. This might be pulling up some hands, but anyway, my point is I'm not going to necessarily get a bunch of huge folds out of position, at least pre-flop, because they're not really seeing that 14-10 number. That's a little something different. So I am 3-betting a fairly wide range in these spots, especially against these types of opponents that open too wide here. And I think my opponent knows that, but I also think that they're not going to want to stack off super light. And so that's a really good quality, because it's going to keep them curious throughout the hand, but ultimately not make it to showdown frequently enough. So I surprisingly get a cold caller of both the raise and the re-raise out of the small blind here in this spot after making it 65, but that doesn't concern me as much as it might some other opponents who I might think would pretty much always have like queens, kings, and aces here. This opponent, I think, can have a lot of kind of random hands. So the original raiser calls, and the flop comes Jack 7 deuce. Now it doesn't look like a particularly great spot for me, but if we really start to go through the range of hands that our opponent can have, I'm really not finding a whole lot of suited cards from Poker NL, who is the person that cold called the raise and the re-raise. I'm also not finding a whole lot of jacks in my opponent's range, although they might have ace jack. But they could also have pocket jacks, pocket sevens, pocket deuces. These are all possibilities for both opponents. But because of the presence of the flush draw, I expect those hands would not slow play, and the fact that if I bet into two people, it will look like I have an overpair so often, and they would just assume that if they check raise me and they have pocket deuces, that I would just go broke with kings, queens, and aces anyway. So I don't really see a lot of slow playing going on here. So I also don't see somebody check calling with a flush draw. I don't think that that would be a line that they would take too much. So I decided to kind of test the waters here, and I go ahead and make a continuation bet, figuring, if Poker NL has a hand like 10s or 9s, they're probably going to have to fold at this point. I sure as hell would not want to be check calling a hand like pocket 9s or 10s in that spot. Especially not sandwiched in between this other opponent. Now this original raiser might be peeling out of position with a hand like pocket 9s, pocket 10s a lot more often, because now it's just going to be heads up. There's some jacks in the range, but there's really nothing strong, I don't think, because of the presence of the flush draw. And the strength that I'm representing, I don't expect anyone to slow play a hand like sevens or deuces there, even though they probably should against some of my higher 3-betting ranges. And I guess where I was going with it when I first started with the hand, where I said people oftentimes fear hands that they shouldn't, this is a good example of what I'm talking about. Sometimes people will, well, a lot of times people will not want a triple barrel here because they would just be so concerned that somebody might have a set or something like that. But I think you got to look at their actions and really think about it deeply. And if you really think about it deeply, there shouldn't really be anything in this opponent's range that can beat anything more than a bluff by the river. So if I just continue barreling, they're just going to have to, if they're going to get to showdown, they're going to have to be calling it with a hand like ace jack, king jack. And it's not like I'm going to be, if they're on ace jack, it's not like I'm going to be ever having jack 10 here or queen jack. It's basically they're going to have to call down thinking well, is this guy just totally full of it or not? Because I really can't beat anything in their value range. And that's a really important concept, I think, in poker, is when you can put people as often as possible in positions where they can't find any of your value range that they can beat, then that oftentimes will induce a lot of folds, because people like to call down a lot lighter when they can beat some percentage of your value range, and especially if they can beat some missed draws. Now in this case there are some potentially missed draws, but a hand like ace jack or king jack cannot beat any of my value range, and that's really important. There are some times when people might be check calling down with a hand like ace jack on, say, an ace 4-4 flop, and they might think that their opponent could bet any ace by the river, or maybe bet at least hands with okay kickers like ace 9, ace 10, and so they're having ace jack going, okay, well, I'm going to check call this guy because I can't beat ace queen, ace king, but I can beat ace 9, ace 10, and then I can beat some bluffs that they might have, and so okay, I think I can call down profitably. But when they can't find anything in your value range, it makes it a lot more disgusting for them. So I decided to sort of rule out the possibility that I was running into sets here, and just decided to put my opponent in a position where they could only beat a complete bluff. And even though the turn and river just bricked out, I just continued to barrel and represent strength. And hey, I mean, why not? I 3-bet somebody from under the gun. I get a cold call over raise and re-raise, and nothing ever slows me down. Why would this be a spot where they wouldn't just give me credit for queens, kings, and aces? So I went ahead and just triple barreled and was able to win a nice pot. But a lot of that came from me knowing my opponent's tendencies. I know that this opponent opens a little too wide early from early position, as their numbers indicate, being a 24-14. And I also know that because they're opening wide, that if they're calling out of position a lot, which this opponent does, that they're also going to flop a lot of marginal hands that are going to fold incorrectly by the river. And so I'm just basically choosing to kind of pounce on that. Now, if I thought my opponent was known for, hero calls, which there are some people that, the better players that know that they open too wide and then they peel out of position too wide, so then they know that their opponents are going to be, especially their better opponents, are going to be encouraged to barrel them a lot because they're going to know they're marginal, which means that in order to compensate for a lot of that, they need to be making a lot of hero calls. And so those opponents, while few and far between, are some of the trickiest ones to play against, and some of the opponents that perhaps I would not want to be jamming that ace-queen that we just had up on the slide before, because I just think that they're just going to be making too many hero calls. So it's definitely going to be really, really important to identify who these opponents are, and that is, again, where your notes come in. I can't stress this enough. Take as many notes as you can. When people are making hero calls, whether or not you're in the pot, take that note down. That's going to go a long way. Now, on the flip side, if you see people making a lot of, getting a lot of situations by the river where they've check called and then they get barreled on the river, and then they click the time bank, and then you just always see by the end they fold, then you can tell that that opponent's probably thinking like, gosh, I know I'm folding the best hand here sometimes, but I just have this philosophy of I just can't go broke with only one pair in a 3-bet pot, or they have some sort of general philosophy that sort of can oftentimes prohibit them from even making the calls in the first place. There's a lot of people, I think I've even been that way before, like when I was in the early stages of my career. It's like, okay, today I'm not going broke with less than with any one pair of hands today. I'm just not going to do it, which is an awful way of thinking about the game, by the way. But I've made that mistake in the past, and so those opponents, obviously, they're going to be just the most beautiful ones every time they look like they are on one pair and they're in a 3-bet pot. Now, obviously, you're not seeing their notes or seeing their thought process, but there's some people that play in such a way that if you're paying attention, their thought process becomes somewhat obvious. And you can tell that, they're just nits that are not going to go broke in those spots. Ranges, betting frequencies be damned, they're just not going to go broke with one pair type hands. And so those opponents are beautiful. The less that they're known for hero calls, the more you just want to put them in spots where they're going to just be marginal as often as possible, and then just put the heat on them. Going down to BC here, will your opponent let you represent scare cards? That's a really good again note to kind of look out for. There are some opponents that I feel like the scarier the board gets when I'm barreling on them, the more likely they are to call me down with just some type of like one pair hand, even on a real ugly board, because the board got ugly. They assume that it's just a better board for me to bluff at, and maybe my range is going to be even more skewed towards bluffs, and so they're going to call me down. Now, those players are few and far between. For the most part, players will just let you represent scare cards. If you 3-bet somebody with Queen Jack or Queen 10, like we showed earlier in the video, and the flop comes down 9-5 deuce, and the opponent check calls you, and then the turn's an ace, and they check, and you bet. Well, some opponents, they're going to think, well, he should be checking behind all his, tens, jacks, queens, kings type of hands, might even check back aces just because now he's got the board so crippled. And so they really only should be betting like ace king and ace queen for value here. And so I'm going to go ahead and again check call, thinking now my pocket eights even have a better chance of being good, because I think that my opponent is just trying to run me over, because I think so much of their value betting range on the flop would want to check behind on a turn like that, which is a perfectly reasonable thought process, I think. But for the most part, from my experience, people just let you represent scare cards. They don't really think in those terms. They just think, oh gosh, there's an ace, and I wasn't even sure if I was good on the flop, and their mentality is, well, now I know I'm not good. I mean, there's an ace, what can I beat? It's like, well, think through their range. You might find a lot more that you can beat than maybe maybe you thought at first. So it's really important to identify who are the opponents that let you represent the scare cards. There's some people, and myself included, who will try and apply the exact opposite logic against the scare cards. So if I check call with like pocket eights on a 9-5 deuce flop, and then the turns an ace, and my opponent barrels into me again, I might just make a check raise on the turn and try and just turn my hand totally into bluff, hoping that maybe I can even get ace queen, ace king to fold, because they should only be able to beat a bluff at this point. And it looks so strong, like I might have a set, and I might just turn the hand totally into a bluff and try and just blow my opponent off the pot, maybe by check raising the turn and then jamming the river, and trying to make them sick to their stomach that way. But again, those opponents are few and far between. For the most part, people are just folding their pocket eights when the turn's an ace in those spots, and they're great cards to represent. We'll play a hand here. This kind of falls in the line of your sort of predictable, like full ring kind of nitty guy. Nothing, not a great player, certainly not a bad player. I mean, a professional player, someone that plays perfectly fine. What you will notice so much is that they just play very fit or fold in these spots, and they kind of turn their hand face up, in my mind, quite a bit. I think that this opponent would probably not be able to resist the temptation and probably just check raise me all in with, or maybe not all in, but at least check raise me with like 4s and 8s pretty often here, just hoping I'll get the money in with ace king. And then be check calling their 9s through queens, and maybe they might have some ace kings and maybe some king queens in their range, but mostly just check calling on the flop with their 9s and queens, and then just give me credit by the turn if I can bet the turn. And so I just went ahead and bet the flop here with my ace jack after 3-betting them, and I got a call there, and then the turn was a 3 of clubs, and they checked, and I just made it about half pot, trying to size my bets to where I can have close to a pot size bet by the river. This opponent, this is the standard, I would say, in my mind. This is a mistake I think on my opponent's part. If they're check calling those flops, I think they should just be expecting to get triple barreled on as often as their value bet on, and probably just be calling down with like 9s through queens in those spots. But most people just don't want to go broke with, they don't even want to go broke with one pair, much less go broke with something less than top pair. So this is, again, sort of the standard. It's not really a hugely interesting hand, but I just dug some of these up, and I was actually going through my Hold'em manager, and I was just finding just countless number of pots that I'd won that were about between $180 and $300 at these limits, where I just basically 3-bet somebody pre-flop and bet the flop and then bet the turn, and they folded by the turn. And there's just so much of that. Moving on to CA here, when to check post-flop. There are some times to certainly give up, and it's important to give up sometimes, because if you sort of become someone who's just automatically betting, then it's going to become easy for certainly the better opponents at the table to eventually figure out a good game plan for you, because they can, like, anytime you can basically predict somebody's actions with near certainty, then if you know are thinking about the game well at all, you ought to be able to exploit that. And so it's important to have give up spots in your range, certainly. When you feel bluffing is hopeless, is a really good spot. I mean, if I 3-bet somebody with I don't know, ace-5 suited out of the blinds, and they call on the button in position, or let's say ace-3 suited with spades, and the flop comes 7, 8, 9 with 2 hearts and a diamond. Well, when I think through my opponent's range and what types of hands they might call a 3-bet with, I find a lot of hands like 2s through 10s, jacks, maybe 2s through jacks. I find a lot of hands like suited connectors like 9-8s and 8-7s and 6-5s and jack-10s and queen-jacks and stuff like that. And then there are some hands, like king-queens, and there's a few hands that I might be able to get to fold. Maybe pocket 2s folds on that flop if I go ahead and continuation bet out of position. But then maybe nothing folds because they are calling, hoping to represent the inevitable, or I shouldn't say inevitable, but pretty likely to come scare card, like 7, 8, 9 with 2 hearts. Any jack, any 10, any 5, any 6, any heart. Diamond will put 2 flush draws on the board. I mean, most of the deck is just, the board just is going to keep getting uglier, and they think that they might be able to represent that those types of hands a lot, and that even if I had a hand as strong as kings or aces pre-flop, that if any one of those cards come in, I'll probably check and they can bet, and I'll probably just have to fold because the board will be so ugly from my overpair. So maybe very few hands fold on that flop, or maybe no hands fold on that flop, but we know for sure very few hands fold on that flop. And so bluffing is somewhat hopeless in that spot, and I would definitely recommend just check folding. You don't really have any great cards to come on the turn. There's really nothing on the turn that makes you feel like you always have the best hand. You can't make the nuts no matter what comes. I mean, it's just not a good situation, and it hits so much of your opponent's range. So I think that's a good spot. I've done a lot of work on a program called Flopzilla, which is an excellent program, and I've plugged in a lot of like your typical regulars 3-bet calling range and position, and I've come up with a lot of boards that I think are pretty good give-up boards. Like the boards where you flop totally nothing, you have like kind of no draw, no pair, no draw, or maybe like an under pair or something, and the flops like jack 10-8 with 2 diamonds, or like queen jack 9 with 2 hearts, or you name it. All these sort of like middling connected boards are generally the good boards to kind of go ahead and give up on. Another opportunity on to check is possibly to indicate to your opponent that you have a made hand, and maybe you want to represent strength in that way rather than barreling through. Maybe sometimes you could represent some type of made hand that is unlikely to fold. Like for example, if you were to 3-bet somebody who opened in, let's say, the hijack, and you 3-bet them, it's a 5-10 game, they make it 30, you make it 90, and you have a hand like king 10 offsuit or something, king jack offsuit, and the flop comes down ace 2-2. So no flush draws, just really dry board, and your opponent checks to you. You can consider from time to time just checking on that board, because it looks so much like you 3-bet them with like a weak ace or pocket queens, pocket kings type of hand, and
you don't really think you can get a, 3 streets of value or anything like that, so you decide to turn your hand into sort of a bluff catcher. Now we know that you have just king high, which is not really a great bluff catcher in that situation, because so much of their out of position calling range is going to be like middle pairs. And so now some opponents might just take a hand like pocket sevens on that board and just like pot the turn and river and try and get you off of a hand like queens. But so many other opponents, when you check back, you represent a lot of like showdown value, I should say. You don't represent a ton of strength, but you represent a hand that's going to be really hard to actually get off of a showdown. And so a lot of times, it goes ace 2-2, and then the turn's an 8, and they'll check again on the turn, and you can just then bet and probably expect them to have pocket sevens a lot, and just expect them to fold almost always on the turn. So sometimes a check can indicate that you have a made hand, especially on a very good board to continuation bet. So if you have another good board would be like king 7 deuce rainbow. You 3-bet somebody, and they would expect you to always bet all your strong hands and all of your air on that type of board. But for the most part, they're just going to be check folding when they have suited connectors and stuff like that. It's a very dry flop. They're just going to be check folding and giving you credit a high percentage of the time with all their jack 10s and queen jacks and pocket 5s and stuff like that. So then you check. Now again, it's a good board. I would generally just almost always continuation bet there, but maybe you've been continuation betting so much and you want to look for some spots to kind of eventually achieve the same result of getting your opponent to fold, but just kind of mix it up a little. Well, yeah, you could check back there, represent a hand like jacks or queens or 10s, and so likely they'll be afraid to bluff you on the turn, and you can just then bet the turn. Now maybe in this case you might only have jack 10, but your opponent thinks when you check back there you have jacks. So anyway, it's just an alternative way to play the hand. It's not my common line, but I do think it merits some discussion, because I don't like to just always be doing the same thing against my opponents. I think that it's just not, obviously, like I was saying earlier. I mean, if your actions become too predictable, then your opponent should be able to find some way to exploit that, if they're any good at all. The last sort of potential option is just trapping. I mean, you 3-bet pocket aces and the flop comes ace 2-2 rainbow. Well, I would definitely not bet that flop, because I think I would much rather just try and hope that my opponent catches up, maybe hits their 5%er on the turn with their pocket pair that causes them to go broke, or just maybe becomes inspired to push me off the hand or something. All I know is that not much good can come from me betting, because I've just got the deck so crippled. So those are just some minor situations. I mean, they don't come up super often. I mean, you're not flopping the nuts like that very often, but feel free to check, in my opinion, in those spots, and expect to maybe get a little more value that way. It might, and also just add a little bit more, a few more checks to your range, I should say. One thing not on the slide that I think merits some discussion, I found a hand where this is not a 3-bet pot, but the concept is basically the same, and I think we can use it just fine. So I'll kind of play through the hand, and basically the idea is to be able to turn your hand into a bluff with a lot of with some of your made hand range, and it's really, really important in 3-bet pots, especially, to be able to do this, especially in spots where you're calling 3 bets, because oftentimes what will happen is you might be calling because you think you might have the best hand, and then a situation comes up in the river where you're not sure if you have the best hand, but you're pretty sure that your opponent will fold. So one example might be like you float a 3-bet with pocket nines on the button after you'd raised the button and your opponent 3-bet you from out of position, and the flop comes down Jack 8-2 with 2 diamonds and a heart, and maybe you have like pocket nines and they're 2 black nines, and so your opponent bets the flop and you call, and then maybe the turn's like a 10 of diamonds and they bet the turn, and now you have, there's a flush on the board, but you don't think your opponent's going to have a flush that often, and they might just be bluffing like, with a random hand they might be bluffing with like an ace king with an ace or a king of diamonds. They might be value betting, obviously really strongly as well. But you decide to call the turn because you think that it'll represent a lot of strength, and then maybe you could turn your hand into a bluff. So the flop, or by the turn, I guess it's like, let's say it was like Jack 8-3, and now it's like Jack 10-8-3, so you've got the open-ender, 3 diamonds on board, you have 2 black nines. They bet, you call, and then the river's like, a 6 of diamonds or something, and then your opponent checks to you. Like, that's a good spot where I'm just going to, assuming stacks are about right, I'm just going to jam the river there, because I think that I'm good some of the time when they check, but I think that they just will always fold because, they probably, in that case, have like 2 black aces and, or 2 black kings a lot of times, and we'll just check fold. So I'll just turn my hand into a bluff. So we'll just play through this hand here. Jacks, I went ahead and peeled in position. On the turn, I went ahead and called again because I thought my opponent could have lots of, could just be trying to barrel me from time to time, could have hands like Queen Jack, Queen 10, might be a type of hand, might have picked up a flush draw of some kind, so I go ahead and call again, and then the river is a 6 of spades and they check, and so I think so often here the board just got really ugly for a hand like King Queen. I could represent some slow played hands, like I would definitely go for value here with like pocket 8s or pocket 5s, and also they might just think that I'm going to take, like, even if they can't find a lot of hands that I would be betting here for value, they just think that I would just take the showdown if I had a hand like King 10 and they had King Queen, and they would just get to showdown, so they check, assuming I would only bet when I actually did back into some really strong hand. But instead I'm actually turning jacks into a bluff here and just betting and picking up the pot. And that's really important, because if they're going to be thinking that I can only basically be, well, that basically my betting range is only going to be when I back into really strong hands, and just assuming I'm just going to take the showdown with a hand like King Jack, and that they can get to showdown with aces, ace king, king queen, and expect me to just check back and take the showdown. Well, once my opponent checks and the board gets that scary, I just think they're pretty much always going to be check folding here. So I might even turn King Queen into a bluff here, thinking that, why even give aces and ace king an opportunity to beat me? So it's really important to have that that sort of thought process in your range, and it's just something I thought I should mention, and it can become especially important in 3-bet pots. So we're going to leave with sort of some parting thoughts here. We'll go through these relatively quickly, and it's just some kind of common questions I see come up about 3-betting, and I see what I view as some mistakes in people's thought process and forums and stuff in 3-bet pots. I think people are especially concerned with balance, and which is what I'm kind of alluding to here in A. Should we try and abuse certain opponents? A lot of people will say, well, I don't want to abuse this guy, but I don't really have anything I can balance a bluff raise with on this board. So I might say, for example, if somebody has a huge 3-bet number and you're calling a 3-bet, and the flop comes King 7 Deuce Rainbow,
and they bet out at you, and like I think you can just raise them there a lot because they so infrequently have a really strong hand on that type of board if they have a really wide 3-betting range. And so some people would say, well, what do I balance that with? I'm not really representing a whole lot here on this board, or what do I balance this with? And it's like, a lot of my thought process is, who cares what you balance this with, or who cares what you're representing? The equation is not what are you representing or what can I balance this with. The equation is, how will my opponent react to this bet? And if I do it over and over again, how will they react also? Well, there's a lot of opponents, I don't care how many times I bluff raise them on a king 7 deuce flop, they are just never going to like rebluff me all in a 3-bet pot with like jack 10. They're just not going to shove air, and if they get called, have 0% equity, or some trivial amount of equity. It's just not in their thought process to do it. They're not just going to like 3-bet with jack 10 offsuit, bet the flop on king 7 deuce, get raised, and then do sort of a stop and go play, like call the raise and then opens jam all in on the turn. They're just not going to be really doing that type of stuff. So, I would just definitely recommend not really concerning yourself with that type of stuff too much. You want to just abuse people relentlessly until basically you realize that it's just no longer working. And for some people, that time will just never come, or against some opponents that will never come. They just, no matter how many times you 3-bet them, or bluff raise them on a board where you're just representing, next to nothing, they're just not going to take their air and fight back. And so if you find those types of opponents, just abuse them. Just abuse them as long as you possibly can. There's no reason to assume they're going to adjust until you know they're going to adjust. So what are the sort of ideal opponents to 3-bet? Well, in my mind, the ideal type of opponent to 3-bet is somebody who is going to play very face-up post-flop. So my favorite type of person is the one who will open, probably a little too wide, will probably call a little too wide pre-flop, and then will oftentimes, or I should say almost all the time, just play their hand very face-up post-flop. So it's like, going back to that 9-5 deuce example, I 3-bet them with king jack, let's say, flop comes down 9-5 deuce, and they check call, and you just know they have jacks as the top part of the range, tens as probably another part of the top end of the range, and they're not going to let me barrel off and trap me with deuces, 5s, or 9s. So they have basically like jacks through 3s that don't have a set, and they'll know by the river that if I'm going to be triple barreling, or they think by the river if I'm triple barreling that I always have queens or better, and they just basically check and hope and just almost never get to showdown unless they turn or river a set. And those types of opponents are just absolutely beautiful because you can just 3-bet them all day long. They're going to flop marginal or air hands most of the time, and they're going to be calling the flop with this mentality of kind of keeping you honest, keeping your ace-king honest, that kind of old school mentality, or keeping your ace-king or ace-queen honest, and then eventually sort of giving you credit for those hands eventually. And you can sort of represent every scare card that comes in, and they're just beautiful. I mean, when you identify those types of opponents that play their hands very face up, aren't too trappy in spots where they probably should be trappy, those are definitely my favorite type of opponents. And when I spot them, will even go so far as to sit with them even with a table of regulars, even though we all like to have a fish at the table. Well, actually that type of opponent can become like a fish because they're going to make so many 10 and 20 blind mistakes against me that over the course of a session, I might be able to win a buy-in just bluffing them and winning 20, 30 big blinds in a small number of pots over the given session. So I think those are really good finds when you can find those types of regulars, and they're generally just the real not necessarily loose or not necessarily tight pre-flop, but probably pretty medium pre-flop, but then play really nitty post-flop. And there's a lot of those guys. So when you find them, mark them down and abuse them. How important is it to become strong in 3-bet pots? Very important if you're the one that's 3-betting, and not important at all if you're the one calling 3-bets. Well, I mean, not important at all might be a little bit of a strong word, but not nearly as important. I've gone through the databases of dozens and dozens of really big winning poker players. People, like, if I were to combine all their winnings, would probably be north of 20 to $30 million between all these pros. And I've yet to find anyone who really won a lot of money calling 3-bets. Most of the opponents I've seen, now heads-up players and stuff like that are different, but in like 6-max and full ring, if you filter for only the hands where they call 3-bets, they are not making a lot of money, and a lot of them are losing money, and a lot of them are, in fact, most of them are actually losing money overall in those spots. But I guess if you were to just fold to a 3-bet every time, you would also be losing those spots. So they're like losing a little less than if they had just folded a 3-bet, which then makes it profitable to call a 3-bet, if that makes sense. But not by much. It's just been really small amounts. But when people become really strong in 3-bet pots where they're the ones that are the 3-better, now, if you filter, and even if you remove in Hold'em Manager with a lot of these really good players, even if you remove the real value hands like aces, queens, kings, and maybe ace-king, let's say, or ace-king's not too much of a value spot. It's pretty neutral usually, but in an all-in matchup. But anyway, it's even if you throw out those hands, the better players have been really big winners in the 3-bet pots. So they've made money with all their ace-x suiteds they've 3-bet and their jack-8 suiteds, and it doesn't mean that they always 3-bet them or that you should always 3-bet them, but they've found the spots to make them profitable. And it's definitely really important to become strong in this area and to be able to read hands and be pretty fearless in these spots. I think it's really important. One of the more interesting concepts, I think, it was almost kind of a little epiphany for me a while back in my career. I kind of grew up, some of you know I wrote a book called Don't Listen to Phil Hellmuth, and I kind of, grew up playing the game. I mean, not grew up playing the game, but in the early parts of my career, I was watching Phil Hellmuth in the top 10 hands, and his Play Poker Like the Pros book, and everything was sort of came from a tight standpoint. I think he had like a No Limit Hold'em System DVD that I bought too, and everything came from a really tight standpoint. And it all sort of the way it was sort of described to me was that the money in poker was won from trapping your opponent or getting all your money in with the best of it, and like that's what the real stud puppies did. And that is just could not be further from the truth. It's absolutely it's just a flawed thought process to think that that's where the profit comes in poker, is just getting the money in good. I mean, if that were the case, there would be a lot more people playing poker professionally. I'd probably form a corporation or something and have a big office building in like New York or something and train like tens of thousands of people to play online poker and just teach them for like spots where they can get the money in good. And I think I could probably pull that off. Poker is so much more than that, and that's just not. And it's just not even true. I mean, you're probably just as likely to, get set. You're just as likely to get set over setted as you are to set over set somebody. I mean, that's just not what the game is about. And so, I was sort of obsessed with like trying to get the money in with this great equity, and getting my money in a 70-30 or an 80-20, and get people to kind of get their money in bad and wait around for when I had a set, and I thought they were on a straight draw and I knew I could have really good equity, and if you really think about it, if you gotta, really kind of like, if you are in that mentality, I should say, really take a step back and think about this for a second. What is really the difference if you were to get your money in, or if you were to run a bluff, I should say, that you knew had an 80% chance of working by the river? Like, let's say you thought that, okay, I'm going to triple barrel this guy on the river, and I think he's probably going to cry and call me 20% of the time, but 80% of the time my opponent is just going to, wet himself and eventually fold his, second pair on this river. Or his overpair, like his small overpair, like pocket eights on a 6-4-4 deuce board. And they're facing a triple barrel, and they know that they can only beat, they can't beat any of your value range, and so maybe you think that opponent will call, 2 times out of 10 in that spot. What is really the difference between running a bluff that has an 80% chance of working and getting your money in with 80% equity? Like, at the end of the day, you've put money into the pot that had an 80% success rate. Like, whether it's a bluff or whether it's a, you've got aces and the guy's got kings and he's going to get it all in and you're going to have 80% equity. And I started to look at poker as like, hey, let me see how many different board textures I can find where my opponent is, only has a 20% chance of hitting the board pretty strongly, so I can expect that if I bluff raise them, it will work. I started really approaching poker that way and started looking for ways to just basically get my money in good without actually getting my money in good, if that makes sense. I'm not getting all the money in with, in an all-in situation with equity in the pot, but what I have is bluffing equity that is sort of equal to the all-in equity in that spot. Now, granted, when you're running these bluffs, they're generally, the pots aren't as big, so it's not as good to have a bluff that basically has quote-unquote 80% equity as it is to be all-in with 80% equity, because obviously the all-in would be more profitable in that case because all your chips would be in. But on the other hand, you can run a lot more bluffs that you have a really strong likelihood to work, bluffs that work 75-80% of the time, whereas trying to find a spot where you can get all the money in 80% with 80% equity is not really something that you're going to really come across too often. In fact, I've just been kind of messing around for the last few days. I've played like 3,000 hands just at like 1-2 no limit on one of the few sites that the Americans can play on, and I was not able to find one situation where I was able to get my money in with 80% equity in thousands of hands. So I mean, if you're talking about a live player who only plays a couple hundred hands an hour, that could be, the better part of a month before they can even find one spot to get their money in good. So to wait for those spots is just not a good idea in my opinion. I would much rather see you just running as many, just looking for as many different spots to run bluffs and get the money in as an 80% favorite. Or it doesn't even need to be 80. It could be, it could be a bluff that, works 40% of the time, but because of the bet sizing, it only needs to work 35% of the time. Well, you should run that bluff. I mean, anywhere where you can find equity is great, but my point is, even if you wanted to play pretty tight, you could find plenty of spots where you can bluff your opponent where it has about an 80% chance of working. And so just look for as many of those spots as you can. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this series, and I'll definitely be looking forward to taking lots of questions in the video comments section. So feel free to get in touch with me there. I'll be very attentive to that, and I'm really enjoying it. I've said it numerous times now, but again, really loving the community. So thanks for having me, and I hope you guys enjoyed this series.